Hey there, art nerds! Today I'm going to show you guys how to paint this very sunny, very pooly watercolor illustration. This is my first narration after Hurricane Ida, and my recording setup is very different since the hurricane, so if anything sounds a little bit weird or a little bit different, that is why. But I am excited to get back to working with you guys. Things are going to be a little bit different, but I can't wait to share this video with you guys. So I am starting today by stretching our watercolor illustration. I have a lot of tutorials where I show you guys how I stretch watercolor illustrations, but the basic materials I'm using are Coroplast, which is like a plastic foam core-esque structure, and this is going to provide support while we're painting our watercolor illustration. It's going to prevent our illustration from buckling and curling up on us as we add water to the paper. I am painting on 100% cotton rag watercolor paper. I'm using Canson Montval cold press, so we do have some surface texture, and I am using my magic disappearing blue lines technique. I inked this illustration with a Sakura Pigma FB brush pen, which is a waterproof brush pen that I highly recommend and I really love, and if you haven't tried it yet, I sure hope you guys will try it. And I am using 3M's blue painter's tape, the type with the crepe surface, as my painter's tape. This is actually meant for painting walls and protecting the wall from paint getting where you don't want it to, but it works really well for holding my watercolor illustrations nice and tight on the stretcher board, and it's fairly easy to remove and doesn't do too much damage to the paper. To make sure everything stays nice and snug when we're adding copious amounts of water, I'm using binder and bulldog clips just to clip everything to the board and hold it in place. So when I stretch a watercolor illustration like this, I allow it to dry for at least a day. Often I allow it to dry for several days. This one dried for a couple of days before I applied my water and watercolor. So I am painting with my Daily Driver watercolor palette. This is a mishmash of all my favorite professional grade watercolor paints, and I want to create the illusion that we have a lot of sunlight hitting this illustration. So I am doing a toning wash of yellow underneath, and then I'm streaking in some brighter, warmer yellows kind of diagonally to look like sun rays. I've been really trying to push my depiction of sunlight in my watercolor illustrations and to create these really bright and vibrant, saturated watercolor illustrations. I've got a bunch of watercolor tutorials and art chats where I'm kind of honing this, and I'm definitely still honing this, but it's something I'm really excited about. It's something I've been playing with a lot lately, and I hope you guys will join me for the journey. So I'll try to link some of those other tutorials and art chats down in the description below. So I allow that to dry fully, and then I kind of go in and add some more yellow here and there. I'm just kind of adjusting what I'm doing. So this video has been time-lapsed several times, so sometimes things seem like they're moving at a blur. And once that had a chance to dry fully, I'm going in with masking fluid, and I'm actually masking off the reflections of the sunlight onto the water, and we're kind of reserving that for later. I'm still honing my water painting techniques. I still have a ways to go. And as I was painting this, I was working from photo references of pools so that I could depict it as best as possible. But what I really think I ought to do is practice and study how other artists handle water and maybe see if I can learn some things from there. Because if you're an artist and you're really struggling with how to capture something, one of the best ways to level up and to improve those skills is to look at how other artists you admire or other artists who are well versed in that subject happen to handle that. So I mentioned a little bit earlier that this is recorded, or the narration was done post Ida. This was painted before Hurricane Ida, and things are very, very, very different now. So we're staying at my mom's house in another town. She has a generator, so we have power here, but we don't necessarily have internet just yet. We actually have to travel a couple towns over in order to get internet. It's definitely a mess. And then the place we were staying at in Norco, our rental does not have power, did not have running water, definitely doesn't have electricity. And our new home in Destrehan doesn't have power, just got running water back, and has a tree in the garage roof. So things are definitely kind of up in the air, and I'm not sure when I'm going to be able to record polished tutorials. We were already in the middle of moving, so things were already kind of complicated, and this has become even more complicated, but I'm just grateful that we're safe, we're healthy, we're in a safe environment. Bowie, our cat, is safe, and we'll just figure things out from there. So I'm glad that I'm even able to sit in a closet and record audio for you guys, because there are people who have it so much worse right now. So if you're financially able to and you enjoy the work that I do, Joseph and I don't need anything, but there are a lot of people who are in a really bad situation right now. So I would really appreciate it if you took the time to research some organizations that are doing actual good, and if you can afford to do so, donate to them. The Cajun Navy is a wonderful grassroots organization that goes out and helps people. It's run by civilians, but you can also donate to local fire departments, food banks, EMTs. Those are some wonderful local organizations that do actual good. So if you have the funds to do so and you like what I do and would like to find some way to help, it would really mean a lot to me, because all of St. Charles Parish was hit really hard. All of Laplace was hit really hard. There are a lot of people who are homeless right now, whose homes were ruined. There are people whose homes can be salvaged but need a lot of help. There are people without electricity and running water. So anything you can give, anything you can donate would be amazing and much appreciated. So once my masking fluid had a chance to dry, I'm going in and I'm applying a toning wash of phthalo blue to start painting the water. And I'm also painting this phthalo blue as kind of an undercolor in our transparent objects. So these pool floats were referenced from the Five Below site, because they've got some really cute pool floats right now. And I have those references up as well, so that I know what I'm painting as I'm painting it. And while this is still wet, I'm going in with some darker phthalo blue and I'm kind of washing it out. So I'm creating these areas of darker blue, more saturated blue, and then lighter, less saturated blue. And I hope you guys can see how the stretcher board is holding everything nice and tight. You do get some buckling as different areas absorb water, but as it dries, it's going to dry nice and flat. And this is a process that takes a little while, but it's so rewarding. I really got into painting this piece and I really enjoyed it. So this one kind of flew by for me. I worked on this piece right after I did the camping trip piece. And those of you who watched the camping trip video know that that one took a while. And I kind of ended up in the weeds with that one, struggling and painting the same things over and over again. With this piece, I knew exactly what I was doing, and I was listening and watching James Mansfield style wigs. So it just went by really quick and I had a really good time painting this piece. And it is of Naomi and Kara and Pancake from my comic 7-inch. Kara just hanging out, chilling in a pool during kind of the last days of summer. This was painted early August. It is now almost September, so we're still in summer. I mean, summer doesn't end until like after Labor Day, right? This still technically counts. And with Ida kind of making everything weird and pushing everything back, I'm not really sure when I'll get this out to you guys. So if it is not summer, do me a favor and pretend it is summer when it goes live, because I'm definitely doing the best that I can here. I'm also using that darker color to start painting some of the shadows, or the cast shadows, where these floats might cast some shadow on the bottom of the pool. I want it to look like the deep end of the pool though, so I'm leaving the shadows still kind of hazy and kind of fuzzy. And now I'm going in and adding some indigo and some marine blue from Magello just to kind of darken that up and develop those colors, because I really want this nice kind of reflective mottled pool color. And I'm using reference the whole time because, like I said, I'm trying to improve how I handle water, and I know I have a ways to go. And the best way to get good at doing anything is to practice over and over and over again. I'm also using that lighter phthalo blue to start painting some of the undershadows on Naomi and Kara and on the pool floats, and this is going to serve as the shadows for the whole piece. So usually I would use contrast color shadows, but since they're in really bright sunlight, I don't want to really deaden that, and I do feel that in the camping trip piece a lot of that got kind of lost. So what I want to do in this piece is I want to focus on local color shadows. So with the skin tones, just using a darker version of the skin tone rather than using a contrasting color for the skin tone. And with skin tones, if you're going to go with the contrasting color route, usually with lighter skin people, it would be like a lighter red violet. With darker skin people, it would be kind of like a red purple, depending on the skin tone, of course. What I would recommend you do if you're just kind of getting started with painting people and painting skin tones, I have some tutorials on the channel. It's more aimed at comic style or cartoony style illustration, since that's what I enjoy and that's what I do. That's what I focus on the most. If you're looking for something more realistic, there are a lot of really great resources here on YouTube. There's also just like great how to paint people resources online. So I'm not necessarily the best one to tell you guys how to go about doing a realistic watercolor illustration, but I'm not a bad resource for talking about cartoony illustration like what I do here. So after allowing the water to dry fully, I'm removing the masking fluid, and I felt like the difference between the white of the paper, the area that I'd reserved, and the blue of the water was too stark. So I'm going in with my phthalo blue and I'm adding another layer, and that's just going to help everything kind of meld together and merge together, so it's not so striking and it's not so noticeable. I can always go back over it with some white gouache or white watercolor pencils and kind of add those highlights back in. So with my watercolor illustrations, I typically paint the things that are the largest, that take up the most space first. So I work from big to small, and I work from general to specific. So in this instance, I'm handling the water first before I start painting the characters and before I start painting the pool floats. And the reason for this is if I start with the pool floats and then I add a bunch of water, I could get some bleeding. And there's some instances where I might want that. And in fact, in this instance, it really would have looked cool if I'd gotten some reflection in the pool floats onto the water, but that's really a your mileage may vary sort of situation. And when I was painting this at the time, I figured it would be a safer way to go if I went ahead and I painted the water and then I painted the skin tones. So for the concrete up there at the top, I mixed together some I'm making a Payne's Gray, and I'm using ultramarine and I believe burnt umber to do that. And these are two really granulating colors, and these work really well for painting concrete or cement because you do get that sedimentation, you get those colors kind of falling out. So it gives you that kind of gritty, granular texture that feels more like pavement or cement. And you also get this really nice kind of color play going because the lapis lazuli, the ultramarine blue, has kind of actually, to be real, modern ultramarine blue is no longer made with lapis lazuli, but it's the same kind of color. They're using PB29, I believe, for modern French ultramarine. But anyway, it kind of falls out of the solution, as does the burnt umber. So you get these browns and these blues, and it just looks really nice. It's really satisfying to look at. So the pool floats are all fruit themed. I thought that would be really cute and fun to paint. So I'm going with a lime for Naomi. So I'm starting with these really bright light greens, and I'm doing a really light wash of it because I really want to imply transparency with this. So that's going to mean layering our greens and building up our greens, but also layering in some of that blue like you can see through to the pool water underneath. And generally with watercolor illustrations like this, I don't build up all one area at any given time. I kind of jump around while things are drying. So as long as they're not adjacent, as long as they're not touching, and there's not really a big chance of them bleeding together, I'll end up painting multiple things or starting multiple things at the same time. So this means I'm mixing up a lot of colors, which is not necessarily the best way of approaching painting if you have a really limited mixing space. And speaking of mixing space, I like to use ceramic palettes when I'm mixing my watercolor. So I have a ceramic dish from Dollar Tree. It was $1. It's one of the square ones. It's one of my favorite mixing surfaces actually, but I also have some watercolor ceramic, like designed for watercolor ceramic mixing surfaces. And I also have some like little like soy sauce and sauce dishes that I got from the Asian Food Mart that work really well for mixing up a wash of color. So you don't have to buy watercolor supplies that are like designated just for watercolor. Any white ceramic plate that doesn't have much of a surface texture, that has like a very smooth glaze on it, will work well for this, and you'll be able to clean your paint off of it completely when you're finished. And not every artist does that, but since I tend to paint very disparate things, I like to clean off my palette so that I can mix fresh colors and kind of start anew. And with this watercolor illustration, I didn't really do anything all that unusual or all that different from my normal watercolor illustrations, other than more of a focus on painting water and trying a few things out with that. I really just enjoy painting, and I enjoy painting for relaxation as well as painting so I can share that with you guys or share it online. So I do a lot of painting. It's one of the ways that I really kind of decompress and I de-stress after a long day. And while we're evacuated for Ida, I haven't necessarily been able to start painting, but it looks like we're going to be evacuated for a while. So I'm going to prioritize setting up a painting place for me to work, a painting station. Fortunately, I'm staying at my mom's house, so there is space for me to do that, and that's something that's really important to me because I do have family members who stress me out a lot, and painting is really important for de-stressing and for me decompressing. So if you're somebody who has anxiety problems, honestly, watercolor can be a great way to start relaxing. I also find inking to be really relaxing. So especially if I have stuff already drawn, if I have stuff already sketched, and I can just kind of focus on the process. So I know people do get into like Zentangle and adult coloring books, and that scratches the itch for some people, but for me, I also like the process of actually creating something of my own. So the whole process, from drawing and doodling and coming up with ideas to refining them and tightening them and inking them and then painting them, can be very relaxing. I mean, sometimes it can be stressful, especially when a painting isn't really going the way that I wanted to, but I think there's value even in that, because you can learn a lot from a failed painting, even if you just learn what not to do. I wanted a lot of bright, fun colors that aren't part of my normal mixing palette, so I pulled out my secondary palette. I call it my Naomi palette because it's colors that she would wear or colors that I use when I'm painting her room in 7-inch Cara, and I thought that those colors would be great for this illustration. We've got some really nice bright greens, we've got some hot pinks, etc. So for the tiles, I wanted a nice turquoise. I guess because that's what most pools have. You don't necessarily see a lot of pools with like hot pink tiles, but that would look pretty good too, but then that would affect the blue, and that would have required some planning. That would have looked awesome, but that would have required more planning than I put into this piece. I was actually trying to get this piece finished so that I could use it for my Kidlit Art Day for August postcard. Kidlit Postcard Day Art for August. Does that make sense? Anyway, it is a monthly event over on Twitter where artists who are looking for work or artists who work in kidlit art share a postcard. Since COVID has actually affected our ability to send out postcards to agents and editors and find new work, this is an attempt to bring that event online, and I really like it. I think it's a really cool idea. And then Ida hit, and I don't have any internet. And it's really hard to be a kidlit illustrator or a comic artist in Louisiana, because not only is this not really an area traditionally that attracts editors and agents, our shows don't really attract that kind of publishing opportunity, but we also get hit with hurricanes and can be out of internet for a while and disconnected from possible work. So I living in Nashville, I mean, Nashville is disconnected from kidlit art and from the, not as a whole, there are some kidlit artists there, but we don't necessarily see a lot of kidlit publishing opportunities. If you're tabling at a show like MTAC, you're not going to meet an editor who works at Viz or who works at Yen Press or who works at, I don't know why I'm drawing a blank, other than I had a really long day today, y'all. We were driving around all day looking for gas and groceries, so my brain is a little bit fried. But anyway, Louisiana is even less likely to attract those opportunities, and that's actually one of the reasons I moved back, because I want to help change that. Columbus, Ohio wasn't always a hub for comics. People moved to Columbus and made it a hub for comics, and I want to do the same thing for Louisiana. Things never change if you're not willing to step in and help be part of that change. And it is a bit of a sacrifice, but I'm from here and I love this place, and I want better for the kids who are younger than me, because it wasn't so great for me growing up. You know what I mean? Like, if it wasn't great for me growing up, I at least want to make it better for the next generation, and maybe better for myself. I mean, that would be great. So I know it skipped a step here, but I had applied a really light wash of hot pink, and I'm just kind of going through and refining that wash. And for Naomi's bathing suit, I'm actually using a really light mix of, it's cherry red, but it's really a quin red. So Holbein cherry red, but it's really quinacridone red, and it's more of a pinkish red, so if you water it down a lot, it's very pink. So it's a color that actually has a lot of range and could be quite useful in your palette. And if you want to darken it up and saturate it a bit more, you can start adding in some alizarin crimson and then start adding in some naphthalide maroon to really kind of build up those colors. So at this point, I'm mostly blocking in colors. Maybe I'm starting to develop some of the shadows. I'm also going back in and doing a bit more underpainting with the phthalo blue in areas where I'm like, that could be a little bit darker. I'm also starting to try to establish more of the transparency. So I'm painting like the grills on the grate at the bottom of the pool, and I'm going to be painting in some of the blue on the pool float, and that's an area that kind of got away from me, and we can talk about it a little bit more. For some reason, that pool float that's off to the side, I just ended up kind of struggling with it. Like, I think the lime turned out really cute, and I think the watermelon turned out really cute. I think the pineapple float that Kara's on ended up getting a little bit busy considering how small it is, but it still stayed pretty cute. But that purple float on the side, I feel like it kind of got away from me, and I had to really work hard to kind of rein it back in. And I've talked about how hindsight is 2020, and it's really easy to self-criticize because I am narrating these in post. This time it was actually maybe 3 weeks since I painted this, so I have like a lot of time to kind of look back and get some distance on the piece and see how I would change it. And I'm not doing this to be hard on my art. I'm not doing this to rag on my art. I'm doing it because it's an exercise that helps me improve, and maybe it's an exercise that helps you improve. If I can show you what I did and then tell you what I would do differently, maybe it'll help you make different choices. You can try the other way and then let me know if that worked out better for you. So because Naomi has a darker skin tone, I usually start out by underpainting the blush and the shadows first, and then I paint her skin tone on top of that, because when you're painting people with darker skin tones and you have a thicker, more saturated mix of color, it can be harder to do really light glazes without lifting up that color. So I found that it works better for me to do those glazes early on, paint the skin tone on top of that, and then do a thicker blush or a thicker shadow just to kind of refine those colors a little bit later on. And I do have, like I mentioned earlier, I do have some tutorials on how I go about handling watercolor cartoony art styles. This is based on my years of painting watercolor comics. I'm not at all saying it's the only way to do it. It's just the way I happen to do it and the way that works for me. I've painted hundreds of watercolor comic pages, so I might be kind of set in my ways. And if you go about it differently, if you have your own methods, that's fantastic. I'm not at all ragging on those methods or dunking on those methods. You know, different artists have different ways. And while I love seeing how other artists work, it's not necessarily going to work every time. You know, like it's a your mileage may vary sort of situation for every artist. So in general, I have a lot of the base colors blocked in. I might even have some of the secondary shadow colors blocked in. I'm pretty much going to just keep working like this from this point on. It's pretty one-to-one. Just in general, when I usually start out with a really thin mix of the colors, so a whole lot of water and just a little bit of the watercolor, and I like to work from dried tube paints that have been dried in half pans. That's just the way I prefer it. I find it easier to control the paint this way. If I'm mixing up a lot of something, or if I'm working with a color that's typically kind of stubborn to activate, then I might work directly from the still wet tube. But in general, I like to work from dried half pans and add them to my water, or pick up some with a really wet brush and kind of squeegee it out onto my ceramic palette and go from there. I'll also reactivate colors on my palette that have dried if I'm still working on the same piece. But in between pieces, I do prefer to refresh my palette and clean it off. That is wasted paint, but I tend to paint kind of disparate things, kind of very different things, and I use the same ceramic plate for all of them. So I might be painting flowers one day, I might be painting people the next. So it can be very different palettes. If I was painting a lot of landscapes where I was using a lot of the same colors, like I went on a trip a while back and I didn't bother to wash my palette in between studies because I was painting a lot of buildings and skyline, and I found that having those on my palette was very convenient as kind of a pre-mixed option. So there's some artists who like to work from that, and that works well for them, and that's great, but that doesn't necessarily work well for me. So I just handle things a little bit differently for the kind of work that I produce and the amount of work that I produce. But somebody asked about it in the paint box, and there are definitely artists who do leave the paint on their palettes. And actually, when I'm painting batches of watercolor pages, I will leave it until a batch is like anywhere from 2 to 4 pages at a time. I try to paint a scene at a time so my colors are all consistent. So I will leave my watercolors on the palette until I've finished that scene, but I do refresh it from scene to scene. It's just nice to have kind of a fresh slate and a fresh start for that. But it does vary from artist to artist. So I am using a purple mixed with some naphthalite. It's like dioxine purple mixed with naphthalide maroon to start painting some of the shadows that I'm going to use on Naomi's skin. You guys can already see that. I'm going to paint her skin tone on top of it. I know it looks kind of weird right now because it's just purple on the skin, and that does have a tendency to look too dark. Well, once I start glazing those nice warmer skin tones on top of it, it's not going to look so strange, but it does give you an opportunity to see how I'm handling the light and where I'm thinking about the light source. And I've mentioned this in some of my other videos, but I kind of cheat if I don't have a specific light source for a specific point in mind. I will either do it from the upper left or the upper right. In this instance, it's coming down from the upper right. And you can see the shadows are making a lot more sense once I've started painting in Naomi's skin tone. So I like to start with a little bit of Venetian red, some burnt umber, and maybe a little bit of Van Dyke brown, as well as a little bit of alizarin crimson to kind of get Naomi's skin tone down. And then I will mix it more saturated, trending more towards Van Dyke brown as I need to add in shadows. But you can see those purple and pink tones show through that initial base color, and they're gonna show through a lot of the layers, and that's a lot easier than trying to glaze those colors or blend out those colors later on top of it. That's how I used to do it that way, where I would add the blush and the shadows closer to the end like I do with lighter skin tones, and I would just end up with really scrubby skin tones on Naomi. And it took a lot of practice and a lot of struggling, a lot of figuring things out to kind of get it the way I wanted it. So like I mentioned earlier, I am narrating this post Ida, so I wanted to actually talk about that a little bit. So I'm sitting on the floor of my mom's closet, and I'm in the closet because it is the quietest room in the house, and there's a lot of clothes to absorb the sound, both from the generator that is powering the electricity going into this house, and we're like the only house on the block that has power because we have a whole house generator. And it also isolates me from the noise of other people in the house. So usually when I'm recording at home, I'm either recording outside where you guys can hear a lot of like environmental noises like the birds and even the trains, or I'm recording in my bedroom where sitting on my bed so that the comforter can kind of absorb some of the echo and bounce. And I'm, as always, recording on my phone using my lavalier mic. I'm going to have to leave the town I'm in order to upload this because we don't have internet, and AT&T out in Luling has always been awful, and it's awful still, and I complain at them all the time and they've done nothing to fix it. They say that no customers ever complain, but customers are always complaining on next door neighbors, so I think they're lying to me. But anyway, I'm just trying to say, like, internet in terms of cell phone internet is always bad out here, but my mom has wireless, so usually I can upload stuff, albeit very slowly, in Luling, but we just don't have any internet at all. Nothing is open for like a 25-mile radius, I would say. Like, all of Luling is shut down. Most of the power lines are down. A lot of trees are down. People are trying to clear the streets themselves, which is good. Like, people are getting to it. Louisiana has a very can-do attitude, and we're very used to just kind of helping ourselves first and not just waiting for people to come and help us. So we're here helping my mom, and then she's going to help us in Destrehan. So it's also kind of a you look out for others, they look out for you kind of scenario. And nothing's really open around here. No grocery stores, nothing. There's some stuff in Kenner and Metairie, and the only way I'm able to find that out is either through text messages from friends as they're starting to venture out too, or from, extended family members. Like Joseph's family let us know that Gonzales was open, and Gonzales is like an hour drive for us. Or when I do get internet on the other side of the river, on the other side of St. Charles Parish, that does have better cell service, then I can pull up Twitter and I can start to see stuff that's open. But historically, news coverage of St. Charles Parish, of the river parishes, is garbage. During Katrina, we could not find out what happened to our area until we were actually able to come back and see for ourselves, because the news only cares about New Orleans. I know that sounds harsh, but I think a lot of people struggle with this. And New Orleans is important, but it's not the only part of Louisiana. So things are going to be really hard and really weird for a lot of people for a long time. I mean, a lot of the schools have gotten just totally wrecked. So I feel really bad for the kids who are like, they were going to be going back to school, or they had just started going back to school, because COVID made things bad, and then this made it worse. But last year we were lucky with Laura, but Lake Charles, had a really long day today. Lake Charles got hit really hard. And then before that, Houston got hit really hard with Harvey. And people ask, why do we continue to live here if it's like this? Well, to be real, I gotta wonder why people live in areas where they get blizzards. Like, I see pictures of my friends who live up north and like what it looks like when it snows there, and I couldn't do that. Or I see pictures of people who live in like California and the forest fires, and I couldn't do that. So for everyone who looks at Louisiana and the devastation we deal with and thinks they couldn't do that, a Louisianian looks at what y'all are dealing with and thinks they couldn't do that. So it's definitely, this is not something I can't deal with. I know that sounds kind of far-fetched, but I've done that. We did this after Katrina. We always figure out a way to rebuild and renew and learn and adapt. And I think that's true for the people who live up north and deal with severe cold, and the people who live where there's forest fires. So it's a matter of loving where you live. And for me, Louisiana has a lot of natural beauty, and I grew up here, and my family has lived here for a few hundred years. So it's in my blood and it's in my bones. And the same goes for Joseph. His family's been here for a few hundred years, just in a different part of Louisiana. So it's just part of who we are. And I wasn't happy living anywhere else. So I think I had to come back. So that's why a lot of people come back. It's not that they couldn't hack it anywhere else. It's not that they weren't educated or don't have the skills to live anywhere else. It's that this place is special to us and we feel a need to come back. And that's why I want to tell stories set in Louisiana. That's why Kara is set in Louisiana. And that's why I pitch stories in Louisiana, because we have a lot to offer and we have a lot to show. And there's a lot of really cool stuff here. And there's a lot of interesting, adventurous stuff here that people just don't know about. And they don't even know what they don't know. They don't even know what they're missing out on. So I want to try and help change that and tell interesting stories and share our culture and our cuisine with other people. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. And that's why I share Louisiana vlogs. I'm actually working on a vlog about my experiences with Ida and what happened here, and maybe even some of the restoration. You know, this is kind of early days, but I'm working on something like that just to kind of give an insider's view, not necessarily biased by news crews or biased by proximity to New Orleans. No offense, New Orleans, you're wonderful, but you get a lot of the spotlight. But just from one person's point of view living out here. And that's something that I'm going to be working on. So I hope you guys will check that out when that comes out. But this place is important to me, and depicting this place is important to me, and protecting this place is important to me. And it inspires a lot of my work, and it inspires a lot of the stories that I tell and that I want to tell. And it made me, and it made me who I am, better and for worse. So it's important to me, and I want to share that with you guys. So now that I've gotten pretty much everything kind of blocked in, a lot of the shadows blocked in, and if you're watching this and you're like, well, she really skimped on explaining that, I have a lot of tutorials where I walk you guys through that. I will link that in the description. So don't worry, friend, I got you covered. So for Naomi's bathing suit, there's a really cute strawberry bathing suit on ModCloth that I'm kind of basing her bathing suit, and her bathing cap is actually from like Olympic swimmers protecting their hair, but I wanted to go something that was more like a bonnet, like a sleep bonnet kind of style, because Naomi is a very cute individual who has a pretty good sense of style. So I know she would be coordinating her bathing suit and her bathing cap together if at all possible. And if that's not possible, that's okay, because this is fiction and I can make it so just for her. So in some of my other watercolor chats, I talk a lot about juggling story versus visual interest. And generally what that means is keeping in line with the world building I've already developed. But this is Kara and Naomi hanging out in a pool, so I can just go with whatever is cutest. I don't have to worry so much about, gee, would this make sense? Would Lilliputians actually do that? Because, I don't know, Kara's wearing a Barbie bathing suit. Like, it doesn't matter. This one's a fun one. And at this point, I'm also trying to paint in some of the cast shadows from the pool floats onto the pool bottom, but I also want that to be a bit more diffused so it doesn't look so intense. I had a really clear vision for this illustration, and I was working pretty heavily from reference, so color selection and color coordination wasn't such a challenge for this illustration. We had some pretty set, straightforward color, and we also had some pretty straightforward lighting. We're in direct sunlight. There's not a lot of cast color. There is some harsher shadows, but that's not necessarily that challenging to develop, especially because I really just wanted to go with more intense versions of the local color, plus a little bit of cast shadow color or cast color from the pool itself. So this illustration only took a couple of days to paint, and I just really got into it and was able to really kind of like sink in and just get painting. And the weather was also on my side. I wasn't waiting long periods of time for the paper to dry. I did the pool water one night, allowed that to dry overnight, and I basically was able to knock out the rest of the painting minus going in and adding in the white details on the next day. And then the next morning, the third really, so I started this in an evening, did the pool water, let that dry overnight, painted all day, and then spent a morning. So it's really 2 days, but it was more like half a day, a whole day, another half a day. And I find that even though I'm tired, starting a new illustration at night and just getting like the toning washes in so that they can dry overnight is a great way to approach something like this rather than waiting all working day for it to dry. So once I finish with the base watercolor illustration, I'm going in with watercolor pencils and adding some details, and I'm definitely cleaning up that water and adding in those white highlights back into the water. And what I really like about watercolor pencils is that I can do them straighted and get that color, or I can kind of diffuse and soften the color using some clean water, as you guys will see. And that just makes for a softer kind of transition than the harsh white of the paper. And then if that's not enough, I can always also go back in with white gouache and get an even whiter white. Now with watercolor, what they'd really rather see, what is preferred, is the white of the paper, but that doesn't always work. And my approach to art and illustration is not what is necessarily considered fine art, despite my education and background. It's what gets the job done, because in comics, that's what's the most important, what gets the job done. If you have to use a combination of techniques, a combination of media, if you have to do traditional and digital, it doesn't matter. It's what gets the job done. So I'm a big fan, not of the purist approach, because that's very gatekeepery. That's very predicated on someone having access to a formal in-school education taught by the right people who have the right insider knowledge, or spending all your time on forums where other people tell you what to do. And that can be a great resource to learn, and you do have to know the rules to break the rules in general. But that can be really stifling, and I think we miss out on a lot of fun, great art that can really speak to you because we're kind of stymied, we're kind of held back by those gatekeepers. So I don't really worry too much about impressing them, because some of them don't want to be impressed. And I just try to make art that I enjoy and that I have fun with, and that I think you guys will enjoy and have fun with. Astute viewers might notice that I'm actually using two different quote-unquote white watercolor pencils. One of them is just white, and this is a more blue kind of white, and then the other is like a titanium buff or a buff white. And whoever, I do not remember who, but whoever suggested utilizing a titanium buff in addition to a titanium white as like my warmer white was a genius, and thank you so much for suggesting it. And I really wish I remember who suggested it, but it's great. I think I saw it during a Daniel Smith workshop at Hands on Creativity, but it has been so good for skin tones, especially Naomi's skin tone. I can use it to add highlights and to lighten certain areas just a little bit, like the palms of her hands just a little bit. And it's not as like weird or muddy looking as the bluer white. It actually looks quite good and quite natural. So that has been such a big help. And I really appreciate someone mentioning that, because it kind of, I don't want to say it was a game changer, but it helped a lot. So once I went in and I added some of those whites, I'm also going in with some of the blues, and I'm still working from reference, and this is not a direct recreation of the reference, but it's me more playing around with techniques and kind of figuring out, and I'm adding some darker blues and I'm adding some shadows around those highlights, and they're going to make some of them pop, but it also creates this indication of shadow from like the crest of the individual little wavelets. Something else that helps, and it might be a little bit of a cheaty cheat, but I don't care, is using watercolor pencils to help clean up areas that got a little bit muddy or a little bit harder to read. So I'm using white, and I'm also going to use a really light pinky purple on that purple pool float to add in some highlights. And I'm also going in with that really light purple. I think it's made by PWC, because I got too dark with it and I didn't leave enough highlights, so it doesn't necessarily look like the sun's hitting it. So this is an area where I'm really reworking it a lot and trying to massage it back into what I wanted. I wasn't entirely successful, but it did look better than it did before, and I did learn a lot. So the more you make mistakes and you try to fix them, the more you're able to learn. So that's why I don't like step by step tutorials necessarily, because there's not a lot of room to learn. I like hearing other artists process, how they were thinking about doing things, what they were thinking at the time, what they were trying to fix, what they would do differently, because for me, that's the most fruitful, because I'm not going to try to paint what they just painted. They already painted that. I don't need to paint that. You know what? Like, they are their own artist. I am my own artist. I want to learn from what they learned. I'm also using the white to add in highlights just kind of everywhere, especially as on that watermelon pool float. And I don't know what's up with the focus. I'm so sorry about that. Sometimes it does really good, and then sometimes my hand gets too close and it messes with the autofocus, so I'm sorry about that. I'm also going to use the white watercolor pencil to add in teeny tiny little water droplets, and then I'm adding just a smidge of shadow using an indigo watercolor pencil. And yeah, I know it's a Derwent Ink 10s. Woo woo. I've talked about that in other videos. Just to add the shadow on that water droplet so it looks like Naomi is actually in this environment and affected by this environment. And as you guys can see, I'm also using white gouache to add in some highlights as well. And you guys might have noticed, I like to use the side blue painter's tape as it's kind of a way for me to mix fully saturated paints or to mix the gouache without dirtying my ceramic plate. It might be a little bit lazy, but it works pretty well for me, and I've been doing it for years. So as always, it's a your mileage may vary situation. It's not necessarily 100% aesthetic, but it works. And y'all know I am all about doing what works for me. As we're kind of wrapping up, nearing the end of this illustration, I just want to point out that, like, me talking about Ida, that's probably going to come up a lot because we were severely impacted. I don't want you guys to feel, guilty. I don't want you guys to worry about me. You're not under any kind of obligation for anything, but this does impact and affect my working situation. It impacts and affects my income. It impacts and affects my ability to make and share work. So I am going to talk about it, and I am going to talk about how it affects the place I love, because I'm an artist. I don't work in a vacuum. I work in this beautiful, vibrant place that was hit kind of hard, and we're definitely going to come back, but it's going to take a while to do so, and I don't want to have to pretend like that didn't happen. It did happen, and it's going to affect me, and it's going to impact me, and it's going to inspire me to tell stories, and it's going to change the way I handle things the same way Katrina did. So I am going to talk about it, and if it makes you uncomfortable, I do apologize that it makes you uncomfortable, particularly to my fellow Louisianians who might find it triggering. I'm not trying to evoke anxiety for anybody. I'm not trying to make anybody scared or worried or upset. That's not my goal at all. But I also know there's going to be Louisianians who hear me talking about it, and they're going to be like, oh, hey, she's from Louisiana too. And they're going to feel a little bit less alone. And I think that's really awesome. I felt super alone after Katrina, and I love it when I'm like watching YouTube and I kind of realize someone whose work I admire is also from Louisiana. I love that. So if I can be part of that for someone else, I'm here for it. So I did want to add a little bit of spray to the water. You know me, I can't help but get a little messy here and there. So I did that with a little bit of loose watery white gouache, and I'm also doing that with that phthalo mix just to kind of break it up and make it look a little bit misty and like they're actually in kind of a pool environment. And I'm also using the watercolor pencils just to add in some colored highlights, like a little bit of pink to her lips. So generally with inked watercolor illustrations, they can start to get a little bit muddy and maybe a little bit not overworked, but just a little confusing. The contrast gets a little bit off because you are sometimes using opaque watercolors on top of inks, and it just dulls down the contrast. So I find it useful to just kind of re-ink certain areas that got a little bit too dull or a little bit too fuzzy. It kind of adjusts the contrast, adjusts the focus a little bit, and it helps pull certain things back into focus. So I'm using that same Sakura Pigma FB that I used to originally ink this piece to go back in and just re-ink a few areas here and there. And that's going to add in some clarity. That's going to readjust some details. And this is a nice technique because you don't have to do it for the whole thing. You can just do it for the areas where you want to readjust the focus and make it easier to notice. So it's actually like pulling tighter focus. And then when we finally finish the piece, it's time to remove our blue painter's tape, pulling away at a 90-degree angle so it doesn't tear into our illustration. And this is one of my favorite parts because you really realize how much paint you just put on the paper when you can see the white of the paper. So here we are, a finished watercolor illustration. I call this one Poolside. It features Naomi and Kara from my comic 7-inch Kara. I will have links to that, links to other tutorials, and links to where you can find more of my work down in the description below. If you enjoy tutorials like this one, your support over on Patreon always helps a lot. But during our time of need here in Louisiana, it would also really mean a lot to me if you could find it in your heart to donate to one of the on-the-ground organizations like the Cajun Navy or local food banks to help Louisianians who are in need, because it is always much appreciated, and there are people who are going to need help getting back on their feet. And once we're in a position to do so, we're also going to donate some time and money helping other Louisianians because it's important. And I would really appreciate it if you guys were able to do so. So I hope you guys enjoyed this tutorial. You guys are definitely going to hear me talking about Ida here and there as we, rebuild and clean things up. But I hope you guys enjoyed hanging out with me. I sure did enjoy hanging out with you. I had a lot of fun painting this, and it's going to be a while until I can paint another illustration like this one. Womp womp. But, I will be able to do that someday, and I am looking forward to that. And hopefully the future holds bigger and brighter things than the things we lost, right? We can always hope for that. So I hope you guys found this helpful, useful, and inspiring. And I want to send a huge, immense thanks to these amazing people, my fantastic patrons who make tutorials like this possible. Thank you guys so much. Thank you. And I hope you guys have a wonderful day. Bye, guys.